Hello, preview staffers. Welcome to the math placement mini module. That's a mouthful. So many M's. I love it. Okay, so here we go. Remember, write down any questions that you have. I'll try to take my time going through everything, but we will be covering, again, doing a review of placement in the next time that we're in class, which is in a week and a half. Similar to how I started the foreign language placement module, I want to take some time and talk about the specific math classes that are influenced by placement before we actually start talking about all the components and reviewing ALEKS and incoming credit and everything like that. So we've got our 4 classes that are listed here. Our basic college algebra, Mac 1105, Mac 1140, which is pre-calculus algebra, and then Mac 1114, which is trigonometry. And that one's 2 credits, so it's always good to note that. And then Mac 1147, which is pre-calculus algebra and trig. And we'll do the breakdown again of how pre-calculus algebra and trig is a combination of Mac 1140 and 1114. But just as a reminder, I know Nigel covered that with you already, but I'm just kind of throwing that out there again before we continue. And then, of course, we've got some of our higher level math classes. We've got Survey of Calculus, which is 3 credits. We've got Mac 2311, which is Analytic Geometry and Calculus 1, which is 4. And then Mac 2312, which is Analytic Geometry and Calculus 2, also a 4-credit class. And we'll go into, again, why I'm bringing these up, but I just wanted to refresh everybody on what the classes were before I jump down the rabbit hole of math placement. Oh, and Mac 2313. What a surprise. Didn't know that one was on here. Yay, Calc 3. So it's important to understand fundamentally the difference between Mac 2233 and Mac 2311, but it's also important to understand the conceptual difference of what it is that it's used for. So Mac 2233, or Survey of Calculus, is commonly referred to as business calc. And that's because it's used, as you can see, really with most of the majors that are in either directly related to the College of Business or business adjacent, such as economics or sport management. And you'll see that those are all the ones that we have listed there. Mac 2311, that sequence, which is leading us up to the class that we commonly call Calc 1, that's going to be something that's going to be more appropriate for students who are interested in a math or a stats major, or most of our science majors, though I don't want to say all of them, because of course there are going to be some that maybe don't require it. And then of course engineering is going to be heavily influenced with calculus, the APK exercise physiology specialization, and then of course most of our pre-health students have to have Calc 1 completed. Again, not all, and we'll talk about pre-health much more in April when we get to that part of the class, but pre-health students are also going to be very need to have Mac 2311 completed for their prerequisites. So let's review sequencing real quick. So when we're talking about the Mac 2233 sequence, if a student's starting at the very beginning and moving forward towards that Survey of Calculus class, they're going to take Mac 1105, and then they're going to take Mac 1140, and then they're going to take Mac 2233. This is different, of course, from the sequencing that a student can complete for Mac 2311. So for that, a student might still start at Mac 1105 and then move into Mac 1140 and then 1114 and then 2311, or they could always do Mac 1147 into 2311. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more as opposed to me just throwing it at you and running off. So again, as a reminder, Mac 1140 and 1114, so that's pre-calculus algebra and trigonometry, is a broken down version of Mac 1147, which is pre-calculus algebra and trigonometry. So it's kind of easy to remember because the names are actually all there for you to kind of cut in half, and then you can see how it separates into 2 different pieces. The reason that we offer a separate option as to how to complete pre-calculus, where you can do it in 2 semesters as opposed to 1, is because not everyone's going to come in with a lot of pre-calculus background. Some students aren't going to have gone up that high in high school, and that's fine. We want to give them other alternatives on how to get towards calculus so that they're not just really in over their heads. Mac 1147 is designed to be a review of pre-calc. So if a student's never had pre-calculus before or does not feel confident at all in their skills, Mac 1147 is probably not the right course for them. They're probably going to be better off doing the split or broken down sequence of 1140 and 1114. Now, in this particular sequencing, I have 1140 before 1114, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. They can be taken in any order, though I find that students tend to take Mac 1140 first from a preparation if they're taking also Intro to Chem or Chem 1, and we'll talk about that when we get into the chemistry module, but technically it doesn't matter which one they do in that order. They just both have to be completed to be able to meet the requirements, or the prerequisites, excuse me, to be able to take MAC 2311. Now, another thing that's worth noting is just kind of paying attention to the fact that the Survey of Calculus sequence is, again, different from Calc 1 because that trigonometry piece is not there. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in, I think, either the next slide or the slide after that as to why it's really important to note that when we're helping our students register for the correct sequencing based on their major interests. So let's talk about some class nuances. So besides, just going over the actual courses that they have in the sequencing, I did want to talk about some of the things that are worth, kind of some of the pitfalls that we might run into with students as it relates to these classes. So for MAC 1140 pre-calculus algebra, a lot of times students will come in if they have a dual enrollment and they'll say they've taken college algebra at a state college, usually in the state of Florida. We want to make sure that we are clarifying, are they talking about MAC 1105 or MAC 1140? Here at UF, we clarify the two classes as basic college algebra and pre-calculus algebra, but other institutions sometimes call them different things, and so calling a class college algebra, that might mean in the student's mind that they think it's 1140, but it's actually, it just can get very confusing. So make sure that you really are checking with them, maybe having them pull up their transcripts if possible to verify what the actual number is, because that of course is going to really have a bearing on what they end up registering for if they need to continue forward on that math sequencing into, let's say, Survey of Calc or Calc 1. Another thing that's worth noting about one of the math classes is that MAC 2233 Survey of Calculus, which again, our business calc, our three credit Survey of Calc class, if a student has credit for MAC 2311, so Calc 1, this will successfully fill in for 2233 or replace it, if you will. It's not the same thing. It's not like you get credit for 2233 if you have credit for 2311, but it can replace that class because it is a higher level version of calculus. If we went back and looked at the sequencing, what you'll notice is that MAC 1140 is also a prerequisite for 2311, in addition to the fact that you have to have trig. So MAC 2311 is MAC 2233 plus trigonometry built into it. So it's a higher level class and can be used to fill in for 2233 if necessary. So if you have a student, let's say, for example, who is bringing in credit for MAC 2311 through AP Calculus, let's say, if they have that credit, but they're a business major, it's not like they have to go and then take MAC 2233 because they don't have that specific course. MAC 2311 can replace it. And that's the point of what I'm trying to make by bringing this up. So it's just really important to know that because it is something that will affect like several of your students. For MAC 2311, and Nigel may have already talked about this, but again, I just want to hit on it just real quickly to make sure. MAC 2311, or Analytic Geometry and Calculus 1, has engineering specific sections. So one of the nuances of Calc 1 is that students that, and as we know, all of our College of Engineering students are going to have to take Calc 1, 2, and 3, or have credit for it, but either way, it's going to have to be completed. If they are taking Calc 1 at UF in the fall, there are engineering specific sections that they would have to register for. Now, they're all during the same time period, and we'll give you a list of those sections for you to be able to make sure that the students are registering for the correct ones. But commonly what happens during preview is that a student will try to register for Calc 1, they'll meet the prerequisites, and for some reason it won't let them, and everyone panics. Usually that's because they're engineering and they're trying to register for a non-engineering section or vice versa. So just be mindful of the fact that there are going to be specific sections for engineering majors, and that's just to help them group together so that they can be around each other and learn engineering specific examples when they're going over those particular math components. And then last but not least, we've got our MAC 2312 versus MAC 2313 discussion as it relates to engineering. So we talked about this a little bit when the College of Engineering group presented during the college presentations, but I do want to hit on it a little bit again here since we are talking about math placement. Keep in mind and remember that the College of Engineering strongly discourages students from going into Calculus 3 if they are bringing in Calc 2 credit through AP Calculus BC. So AP Calc BC gives students credits for Calc 1 and Calc 2. If a student has credit for Calc 2, technically they can go into Calc 3. That is their right, their option to be able to do so. But they're discouraged from doing that by engineering for the following reasons. So while students might be very successful going into Calculus 3 with the Calc BC exam directly out of or directly coming into UF, the problem is going to actually come from when they have to take differential equations, which is MAP 2302, which all engineering students are also required to complete. So that class that class builds on knowledge that you get in MAC 2312 when you take it at UF. The AP Calc BC version of Calculus 2 is missing about maybe 30% of the content that we cover in the University of Florida class, and that 30% is really connected to what the students learn in MAP 2302. So while we have engineering students who will come in, do very well in Calc BC, take Calc 3, be fine, and say, what's going on? Like, why did you tell me not to do this? It's okay. What happens is the struggle doesn't happen until this following semester when they take differential equations. And then all of a sudden they're missing those really core components that were covered in the Calc 2 class at UF. And we just want to try to help avoid students fall into that problem down the line. So that's why, just kind of recap why engineering is very adamant about students retaking Calculus 2, even if they already have credit for it through AP Calc BC. So let's actually move on to math placement now and kind of get away from all that class information. So what do we use when we're talking about math placement? We really have two different evaluating techniques that we're using. We're using the ALEKS exam, which we'll talk about, and then also incoming credit. And so incoming credit could be credit by exam, so AP, ACE, IB, or it could be dual enrollment. We will use any of those options to be able to help evaluate where a student places in mathematics. So the placement type for ALEKS exam, so that's the exam that students can take online. They're not going to take it at preview. We don't want them to do it, but we do strongly encourage them to take it when they complete preview prep. We remind them and make sure that they have that completed before they get to preview, just so that it'll help make things a little bit easier when we're helping them register for their classes. But ALEKS is required for students to be able to have access to MAC 1105, 1140, 1147, 2233, and 2311. If the student doesn't have any incoming credit that we can use to evaluate placement for those classes, they do need to have the ALEKS exam to be able to register for any of those. And we'll talk about what scores they need in just a second. So MAC 2233 and the MAC 2311, we've got our two separate boxes here to look at and our required scores that the students need to have to be able to enter into those classes. What you'll notice is that for MAC 1105 and MAC 1140, the scores are the same, right? So a student scores on ALEKS 30 or a 32 or something, then MAC 1105 is going to be the recommended class. If the student scores a 45, then MAC 1140 is going to be the recommended class no matter which breakdown we're looking at. What gets tricky is depending upon what particular sequence of calc the student wants to go into when we get into the 50 plus level. So you'll notice that if the student's interested in doing MAC 2233 or business calc, then if they score a 50 or higher, they're eligible to enroll in Survey of Calculus. That's fine. If the student scores a 50 through a 74, as you can see for MAC 1147 in the MAC 2311 breakdown, it's a little different. So students aren't able to hit that Calc 1 level for the MAC 2311 breakdown until they hit 75. So it's a little bit higher, and that has to do with the fact that, again, we were talking about the differences between the two classes. That has to do with it, again, about that trigonometry piece and just that higher level step that MAC 2311 is giving students beyond kind of what Survey of Calc is teaching. So it's important to note which sequence applies, because if a student has, let's say, like a 60% on ALEKS, your recommendation is going to be very different. It could be MAC 2233, it could be MAC 1147. It depends on which sequence they want that applies to what majors or career paths or pre-professional paths that they're interested in. So just be mindful of that when you're working with students. And this is just an example of what it looks like, kind of the breakdown that we were talking about, but also with the scores, the sequencing with the scores for ALEKS on the left side. This is actually what it looks like in the preview workbook. So this is what the students are going to be able to see, which really clearly marks for them like what classes they're going to start in, and then kind of what the next steps are after they take those classes in the fall semester. So this is a reminder, just it's okay to use incoming credits to determine placement. A lot of times we fall onto ALEKS and we use that as our only way of figuring out if a student is eligible to register for a certain math class, and that's not true. We can of course use incoming credits, and we will a lot of the times, to determine placement. But the big thing about using incoming credits is whether or not we can use predictions, because as opposed to ALEKS where either you have the score or you don't, with incoming credit, a lot of what we're going to be doing is based on what the students are telling us they may or may not have earned with their AP, IB, or ACE credits, or ACE scores rather, excuse me. Unconfirmed scores or grades, or predictions as we call them, are okay for a lot of classes at UF, or a lot of the classes the students might want to take upon coming in. It's okay for the psych classes, it's okay for those composition classes that we talked about way back in that incoming credit module, and it's okay actually for some math classes, but there are several math classes that we can't use predictions for, and also for some chem classes, and we'll talk about that in a second. Keep in mind that preview prep is self-reported, and we've talked about this in the academic labs a couple times. That means it's a prediction. So if the student has on preview prep, whether or not, they maybe have put, oh, I have AP Calculus AB, I got a 4, that's great, but until we can actually verify the grade or verify the score in the class, it's a prediction to us. So preview prep is not, because it's self-reported, it's not something we can use to confirm anything. What we would need for a confirmation is we would either need to have everything, either have it reported at UF, or we can actually have the student bring up and show us an unofficial copy of a transcript that would maybe show us a grade that they earned if it's a dual enrollment issue, or bring in or pull up on the College Board website the score report of what they received, and we can verify it that way. So it doesn't have to be officially received by UF. We're not monsters. If we can verify it via the student through unofficial means, that's okay too, but we do need to see something to verify. We can't use the preview prep sheet as that verification factor. So what can we not use predictions for? So we cannot use predictions for MAC 2233, so Survey of Calc, or MAC 2311, Calculus 1. So the top of our sequencing that we were looking at before, our top 2 classes, those are the ones that we cannot use predictions. So if a student comes in and is predicting credit for MAC 1147 and they want to retake it, that's fine. But if a student, let's say, is coming in and says, well, I think I got an AP Calc, a 3, but I want to retake Calc 1, can I just register? And they haven't taken ALEKS yet, the answer is no. We cannot allow them to register for the class until they show us their scores, or they go home and they take the ALEKS exam. Now things get a little tricky when we start talking about the higher level classes. We cannot use predictions for Calc 1 and Survey of Calc, but we can use predictions. It's okay to use predictions for Calc 2 or higher, so MAC 2312 or higher. This, I understand, seems maybe counterintuitive. It seems like, okay, well, we can use it for the lower level classes, but then when we get into the higher level ones, we can't, but then we can. I understand it. But the reasoning behind this is that the math department feels that it's okay or rather that students are unlikely to register for Calc 2 and then stay in Calc 2 if they don't have the credit, the prerequisites to be able to do it. Sometimes students will overestimate their abilities for Calc 1. It's rare that you'd have a student be like, I'll be fine in Calc 3 without any Calc background, whatever. This is not going to happen. So they're okay with allowing students to register for those higher level calculus classes, if appropriate, if they need to, and we can use predictions to help them do that. And then just a reminder, incoming credit supersedes ALEKS placement. So similar to what we were talking about with incoming credit superseding other classes during the general module, this is the same kind of idea. We can't say that ALEKS is more valuable or more valid than an incoming credit class. So for the example, if a student, let's say, earns a 60% on ALEKS, but then has Calc 1 credit for AP Calc, and they want to if they want to repeat Calc 1, they can do that because they have access to Calc 1 via their incoming credit. And we can use that to supersede the ALEKS placement, and that's okay. Now here's just some helpful tips. So kind of like what we were doing with the class nuances, these are some nuances as it relates to incoming credits for math placement. Keep in mind, and we've talked about this before, but IB Math Studies is not an effective placement tool. And that's because it does not have anything to do with the pre-calculus or calculus sequencing. It has to do with math studies. I think students get credit for MGF 1106 if they take the class. And so that's liberal arts math, which is great, that's fine, but it doesn't have anything to do with this and with placement. So we don't use that as any sort of barometer of where a student could enter into a pre-calc or calc class. A friendly reminder, AP Calculus AB and BC are two different exams. So just to be, mindful of that. If a student's saying, oh, I took AP Calc, it's always good to clarify which one they did. A lot of students think of it like Calc 1 and Calc 2, so you can always ask them to clarify that way, but just making sure that we're talking about the same things. So earning credit for Mac 2311 with a 3 on AP Calc AB, which means you get credit for Calc 1, doesn't mean you're automatically prepared for Calculus 2. And this is a really important thing, and we talked about this earlier in the, I think, general placement module as well, is we talked about how it's important, there's a difference between what a student can do and what we recommend that a student should do. There's going to be differences there. So for this example, if a student has a 3 on AP Calc, they can go into Calc 2. They are eligible to do so, but I don't know if I would recommend it. It would depend on their confidence level. It would depend on a lot of different things, but from a general standpoint, I would probably encourage them to repeat Calc 1 if they wanted to, if they needed to go into Calc 2 at some point in the future, just because our data shows that students who go into Calc 2 with only a 3 tend to average below a B, I think it is, in Calc 2, and that's not very good. So I'd like to try to help a student avoid that and make sure they have a better foundation at UF before moving into that Calc 2 class. So again, there's a difference. I can tell a student, yes, you could register for Calc 2, but my recommendation would be this. And that's going to be a lot of the ways that you're going to advise students while at preview. So let's actually talk about some hypothetical scenarios or questions that you might have about placement. So would you ever not recommend a student take the ALEKS exam? That's weirdly worded, but we'll go with it, I guess. And the answer is, of course, sure, that's absolutely possible. It's only required or recommended for students who plan to take some part of the pre-calculus calculus sequencing. So if you have a student who has no interest whatsoever in a major or minor or a pre-college program, pre-professional program that requires some form of these pre-calculus calculus classes, wow, I can't talk at all right now, I'm so sorry, then it's not going to be important for them to obviously take the ALEKS. Why would they need to? However, let's think about it this way. So English is a good example. An English student would not need to take ALEKS for any reason, but would you ever recommend an English major to take the ALEKS exam? And the answer is, of course, potentially, if they had an interest in pre-health, because you can be pre-health in any major, right? Or if they had interest in other majors or minors that have pre-calc component. So it's about understanding more than just, the simple, okay, does your major require it? No, okay, no, you don't have to. Or just, again, that idea of throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks is just telling everyone to take ALEKS. That's unnecessary too. There's nuances to it and individual components that we use to evaluate whether or not it's something that's applicable for each individual student. So if you have a student who comes in and says, well, can I start in a different math class than what ALEKS places me into? And if the student wants to go down a step, then the answer is yes, that's fine. So let's say the student places into Mac 1147 and they are a biology major and they're saying, you know what, I just got the cutoff into Mac 1147, but I really think I want to take the Mac 1140, 1114 sequence. Can I do that? Sure, of course, that's fine if they want to go down a step. That's, make sure it's appropriate. I have had students in the past come in who, at preview, who placed highly into Calc 1, so a 90%, and then try to convince me that they should take Mac 1105 just based on their complete worry about going into Calc 1. And I mean, I respect and validate that, but there's also something to take into consideration about being just bored out of your mind and not challenged and having that be a different kind of stressful experience if you go too far down in levels. So in this situation, I think going down one step is fine. Anything more than that, I think you want to have a really serious conversation about why that is, and if this is maybe a good path for the student to take in general if they're that worried about the math. Now, if the student wants to go up a step, the answer is going to be most likely no, ... So there's other factors that we can take into consideration. So if the student places into a certain class with ALEKS, but they have incoming credit, like we just talked about, that supersedes it. So we can use that to potentially override whatever their ALEKS score was, wherever their ALEKS score placed them. The other alternative is that they could retake ALEKS. Again, not a preview. And we don't encourage students to do this. We really don't, because the ALEKS exam the first time is really our best indication of where a student should place. We have data from a few years ago of what it looks like if a student retakes ALEKS and then uses the higher score to get into a class, how they perform, and it's not good. As you can imagine, if a student gets a 35% on ALEKS, that's okay, and then they take it again and get an 80 and they go into Calc 1 versus Mac 1105, that's a big jump. Those students tend to not do well because they're learning the test. They're not necessarily learning, they don't have that background to be successful in the course itself. So no, students can't go up, but if the student asks you if they can retake ALEKS, I mean, we don't want to lie. Again, that's just not what we do. So you can tell them they can retake it, but we would strongly discourage it. And if they do score a higher percentage, then they could potentially go into a higher level class. If a student still needs a gen ed mathematics course, does the student have to take it his or her first term? Well, this goes back to kind of a very long time ago module where we talked about helping a student build a schedule, and the answer is, of course, no, absolutely not. If the student wants to take the gen ed math course their first semester, of course they can, but they by no means have to. Students can complete their gen eds at any time before they graduate. And of course, there are going to be some majors, and we've talked about them, that are going to require gen eds done in the first 2 years, but there's plenty of time for that. So the first term is not necessary by any means. And especially if the student's concerned about math, and we don't really know if the student is, but if they are, then they definitely shouldn't take it their first term, because we really want to make sure we're setting them up for success their first semester. Getting things out of the way, as you know, as we've talked about many a time, is never a good idea or a good plan for students. What would you say to a student who wants to retake Mac 2311? And this is a really good question. There's a lot of different factors that I would consider when thinking about this. So my first question would be, why do you want to retake it? And learning more about where that drive is coming from. Is it because of pre-health prerequisites? Well, that's something worth thinking about, because technically students don't have to necessarily retake Calc 1 for pre-health. And we'll talk about that one more when we get to pre-health, but that's something that would be really important to know. Is it because the student wants a strong foundation for sequencing? And then my next question is, do you need to take Calc 2 for your major? You would be shocked how many students think they need to take Calc 1 over again just because. Even if they're not interested at all in a major that then goes on to Calc 2. And that comes from, I think, advising in a lot of ways, whether it's from us or staffers or advisors or whoever, is just kind of falling into the trap of going, oh yeah, sure, retake that, that's fine, without really ever asking, like, but why do you want to do that? And if the student is, let's say, interested in biology, which doesn't require a student complete Calc 2, they can, but they can also use statistics instead. There's really no reason to repeat it just for the sake of repeating it. They don't have to move forward, so that foundation argument isn't really a valid, well, it's not valid, but it isn't necessarily a strong one to make. Now, if a student's engineering, of course there could be value in retaking the class. They have to go up through differential equations. They're going to need to move forward in calculus. It makes sense. But we want to make sure we're asking that question and looking into whether or not Calculus 2 is a requirement for the student's interests. If it isn't, then that's not really a good argument to make. And then, of course, if the student already has a passing grade through dual enrollment, it may not be in the student's best interest to retake the class. There's a difference, of course, between a student having credit by exam and a passing score, and then actually having a grade in the course. Sometimes, at that point, if the student has the passing grade and they don't need to go any further in it, just let it be. Let them take the class, or rather, let them use the class they already have completed, and it's done, and that's fine. So we want to be careful we're not just automatically saying yes to this question just by default, because it just seems like it might be a good idea or the best thing to do. Make sure you're finding out why. And herein endeth the lesson for math. I'm going to move into one more module with chemistry, and then that's going to be it. So hopefully you enjoyed your time in this very fun PowerPoint that I really like, with swirls and math looking things and stars. I don't know. I like how it looks. It's fine. Anyways, all right. Getting tired. Moving on.